The rope bit into Abel Cooper's palms even as the sea tried to tear it away, and he knew with the flat certainty of a man, out of options, that his fingers would not hold much longer. The Nar had broken apart somewhere behind him in the dark, timbers screaming as the storm took it apart plank by plank, and the fjord's black water kept dragging him under before spitting him back up just long enough to see how far the shore had drifted. Salt filled his mouth. Lightning cracked over the cliffs and showed him nothing but more water, more froth, more of the storm's teeth. Then a hand closed around his wrist like a manacle, and he was hauled upward through the waves so hard his shoulder screamed in its socket. "Do not fight me," a voice snarled against the wind, low and rough and utterly unbothered by the chaos around them. "Fighting me will get you drowned faster than the sea will manage on its own." He had no strength left to fight anyone. He let the grip drag him against a broad shoulder, felt himself half thrown, half hoisted over the gunwale of a smaller boat that should not have been able to survive these swells at all. And then he was lying on his back staring up into green eyes and rain, and the sharp, tusked outline of an orc woman who was looking down at him like he had personally offended her by nearly dying. "You are an idiot," she said, water sheeting off her dark hair, off the leather vest molded to her shoulders, off the corded muscle of arms that had just hauled a grown man out of a killing sea like he weighed nothing. "A trader with no sense drowns just as dead as a trader with plenty." Abel coughed seawater onto the deck and managed, through the ringing in his skull, "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," she said. "We are not out of this." She turned from him without another word, already hauling on lines, already shouting orders in a mix of the trade tongue and guttural Orcish to men and women he could barely see through the rain. And Abel Cooper lay against the boards of a strange little skiff in the heart of a fjord storm, alive because a stranger had decided he would be, and had absolutely no idea that this would not be the last time. He did not learn her name until the storm had passed, and the gray light of morning showed him the ruin of the coast, half his cargo gone to the bottom along with 2 good mules and a season's profit in salt casks. The skiff had made a rocky cove below the cliffs, and the crew that had somehow kept it afloat through the night sat exhausted among coiled ropes, human and orc alike, sharing what dry bread remained. The orc woman who had pulled him from the water sat apart from the rest, wringing water from her hair, watching him with an unreadable expression that made him feel, absurdly, like he was being weighed on some scale he could not see. "Bagrak," she said finally when he worked up the nerve to approach. "Bagrak Wildheart, deckhand of the Sea Wolf, may her bones rest gently on the bottom." "Abel Cooper," he said, "I trade salt and spice up the passes to the Highland holds, or I did until last night ate my stock." Something flickered across her face, gone before he could name it. "Cooper," she repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in her mouth. "I know the name." "I doubt it," he said, managing a tired smile despite the cold soaking into his bones. "I am not exactly a name men sing about." "No," she agreed, and there was something almost fond in the way she said it, though he could not have told you why. "You are not." She did not explain what she meant, and when he tried to press, she was already moving away, barking at a crewman about the state of the remaining lines, leaving him sitting on the wet rocks with the strange, unsettled feeling that he had met her before and simply did not remember it. He did remember her, in fact, though it took 3 more days of walking the coast road toward the trading post at Kelda's, landing for the memory to surface whole, the way a stone works its way up through a plowed field after a hard winter. 7 years passed. He had been a boy of 20 trailing his father's mule train up from the coast, green as spring grass and terrified of every shadow, because his father had filled his head with old war stories about orc raiders. They had stopped at a harbor market to trade, and there had been a scuffle, a gang of dockhands baiting a young orc girl who had come alone to sell carved bone trinkets, knocking her wares into the mud and laughing while she stood rigid and furious and utterly outnumbered. Abel, more frightened of his own cowardice than of the dockhands, had waded in without thinking, gathered up her scattered carvings, and stood beside her until the men grew bored and wandered off. She had not thanked him. She had simply looked at him for a long moment with green eyes too old for her young face, then pressed one small carved wolf into his palm and walked away without a word. He still had that wolf. It rode in the bottom of his pack, wrapped in oilcloth, worn smooth by years of his thumb passing over its back on lonely nights on the trail. He had been a boy then. She had been a girl, perhaps 16 summers, though orc reckoning of years ran differently than human, and he had never been sure. Enough years now separated that harbor market from this storm-racked cove that neither of them was a child any longer, and when he finally placed her face against the memory of that furious young girl, his breath caught so hard he nearly choked on the sea air still clinging to his lungs. He found her that evening, sitting alone at the edge of the fisher camp the survivors had made, mending a torn line with quick, sure fingers. Firelight caught the line of her jaw, the strong column of her throat, the leather vest laced snug over a linen shirt gone translucent with old salt stains, the travel leathers hugging powerful legs crossed at the ankle. She was, he thought with the sudden clarity of a man struck by lightning, the most striking woman he had ever seen, and he had spent 7 years half in love with a memory of her without knowing it. "You gave me a wolf," he said before he lost his nerve. "At a harbor market, 7 years gone, maybe more. I was a boy with my father's mule train, and some dockhands were giving you grief over your carvings." Her hands stilled on the rope. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and the fire popped and hissed between them. "I remember a fool boy who could not fight worth spitting," she said at last, "but who stood anyway. That was me." "I know," she said simply, and went back to her mending as though the conversation had cost her nothing, though her jaw was tight enough that he could see the muscle jump beneath her green-gray skin. "You knew when you pulled me from the water," Abel said slowly. "You knew who I was." "I knew the moment I saw your fool face over the gunwale of a supply boat 2 winters past at Kelda's Landing," Bagrak said, "and there was an edge to it now, something guarded. I have known for some time Abel Cooper." "Then why did you never say?" "Because knowing a man's face and having a right to speak to him are different things," she said, and stood, coiling the mended rope over one broad shoulder, and walked off into the dark before he could ask what in the world that was supposed to mean. It would not be the last time she vanished on him mid-conversation, leaving a hook of a question caught in his chest with no answer at the end of it. The trading post at Kelda's Landing sat at the mouth of the pass road that climbed up into the highlands. A scatter of stone buildings and timber warehouses clustered around a harbor that served both human coastal traders and the orc clans who held the fjord country above. It was not a comfortable peace between the two peoples, not yet. Not fully old wounds from the border wars ran deep enough that human merchants still crossed the street to avoid orc patrols, and orc traders still spat at the ground when certain human names were spoken. But it was a peace, hard won and carefully tended, and men like Abel Cooper made their living walking the knife's edge of it, carrying salt and preserved goods up into the highland holds, and bringing back furs and ore, and the strange, sharp spices the clans traded down from lands even farther east. He had lost most of his stock in the wreck, but he had not lost his contracts, and a trader who failed to deliver lost his contracts fast enough after that. He spent 2 days at Kelda's Landing scraping together what salt he could buy on credit, hiring a pair of mules to replace the drowned ones, and trying very hard not to think about a pair of green eyes that kept finding him across the market square with unsettling frequency. She was there when he loaded his mules. She was there again 2 mornings later when he set out on the pass road, riding past him on a shaggy highland pony with a string of trade goods behind her, offering him nothing more than a short nod before urging her pony ahead and vanishing around the first switchback. "You keep turning up, Bagrak Wildheart," he called after her, more amused than he had any right to be, given how tired and poor and generally battered he felt. A man might start to think it was on purpose. She did not answer, but he thought, though he could not be certain at that distance in that light, that he saw the corner of her mouth curl before she was gone. The mountain road above Kelda's landing was not kind to careless men. It climbed in narrow switchbacks along cliffs that dropped 100 feet or more to the fjord below, threaded through stands of black pine where the wind screamed like something alive, and passed within a stone's throw of caves and crevices that had sheltered more than one band of highway robbers over the years. Abel had walked it a dozen times without incident, and had grown, perhaps, a little too comfortable with the illusion of safety that familiarity buys. He was 3 days up the pass, his 2 hired porters trudging behind the mule's string, when the ambush came. They dropped from the rocks above the trail without warning. 4 men, ragged and hard-eyed, the kind of desperate men the war had left behind on both sides of the old border, men with nothing left to lose and knives that said they knew how to use them. One of them had a length of chain already looped around Abel's throat before he understood what was happening, dragging him backward off his feet, while the others fell on the mule's string, cutting free the salt casks, ignoring the porters who threw down their staves and ran for their lives without a backward glance. Abel clawed at the chain, black spots blooming at the edges of his vision, and thought with strange, distant clarity that this was a stupid, unremarkable way for a man to die, strangled on a mountain road over a season's worth of salt. Then the man holding the chain made a sound like a dropped sack of grain and simply was not holding the chain anymore. Abel hit the ground hard, sucking in air that tasted of pine and blood, and through the swimming haze of his vision he saw Bagrak Wildheart standing over the fallen robber with a short axe in one hand, her leather vest dark with the spatter of a fight already half finished, 2 more of the robbers already down and groaning in the scree, the 4th scrambling backward with his hands up, babbling something about mercy. "Run," she told him, not unkindly, and the man ran and did not look back. She turned to Abel and knelt beside him, her hands rough and sure as she checked the raw welt around his throat, and for a moment her expression was so naked with fear and fury that it stole what little breath he had left. "You keep nearly dying," she said, low and rough. "It is becoming a habit I do not care for." "You keep saving me," he rasped. "It is becoming a habit I am starting to expect." "Do not expect it," she said sharply, standing, sheathing the axe at her hip with a motion too practiced to be anything but old habit. "Expect nothing from me, Abel Cooper." "Then why are you here?" he demanded, pushing himself upright despite the way the world tilted, because if she was going to keep vanishing after every rescue without a word of explanation, he was at least going to make her answer that much. "You are a deckhand on a coastal nar, Bagrak. This road is 3 days inland from any harbor. You should not be here at all, and yet here you are, for the 2nd time in a fortnight, pulling me out of one disaster or another. Why do you keep circling back to me?" Something moved behind her eyes, something that looked almost like grief, and for one taut moment he thought she might actually tell him. Then her jaw set, and the moment closed like a door. "Gather what is left of your salt," she said instead, "and be more careful on this road. I will not always be nearby." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one you are getting today," she said, and turned to help him salvage what remained of his cargo, working in a silence so thorough it felt like its own kind of confession, though he could not have said what it confessed to. He should have let it go. He told himself that a dozen times over the following weeks as his trade route wound him deeper into the highlands, up past Kelda's landing to the great clan hold that crowned the cliffs above the deepest reach of the fjord, a sprawl of timber longhouses roofed in turf and hide, smoke rising from 100 hearths into a sky the color of steel. This was the seat of Clan Wildheart, ruled by a chieftain named Grandar whose reputation for both fairness and ferocity preceded him up and down the coast, and Abel had traded here twice before without incident, exchanging his salt for furs and ore under the watchful, wary eyes of a people who had not forgotten, and would perhaps never forget, exactly how many of their kin had died in the old border wars. He should have let the matter of Bagrak Wildheart go. He did not. She was there again at the clan hold, unloading crates from a trade sledge near the boat sheds that clung to the cliff face below the longhouses, and the sight of her in the gray highland light, her dark hair loose for once instead of braided back, the muscles of her forearms flexing as she hefted crates that would have staggered two ordinary men, hit him with a force that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way his chest had started doing something complicated and undignified whenever she was near. "Wildheart," he said, testing the sound of her family name against what he had begun to suspect. "That is the chieftain's name, too." She did not look up from her work. "It is. Are you his daughter, Bagrak?" Now she looked up, and there was something wary in her face, something that told him he had touched a nerve she had been guarding carefully. "I am," she said. "Does that trouble you?" "No," he said honestly. "It explains a few things. It does not explain why a chieftain's daughter is hauling crates on the docks instead of sitting warm in her father's hall." "I would rather have salt in my hands than idleness in my lap," she said, and there was pride in it, and something older and harder besides, and he thought, though he did not say it aloud, that a woman who chose deckhand's work over a hall seat was a woman running from something. He did not learn what until nearly a month later, and it was a fisherman's careless gossip in the trading hall below the longhouses that told him, not Bagrak herself. "Wildheart's daughter," the old man said around a mouthful of dried fish, not troubling to lower his voice, "promised to Ironjaw's boy before the first snow. Blood price already paid in ore and iron." Old Grandar swore to end the feud between the clans, and a chieftain's word is a chieftain's word, whatever the girl thinks of it. Abel set down his cup very carefully because his hands had begun to shake and he did not trust himself to hold anything heavier. "Ironjaw," he said. "You mean Thakar Ironjaw?" "The very same," the fisherman said, oblivious to the way the words had just gutted the man across the table from him. "Good match, they say. Ends 30 years of blood between the clans. Girl does not seem to care for it, mind, but what girl gets a say in these things?" Abel found Bagrak that evening on the cliff path above the boat sheds where she often walked alone at dusk, and he did not bother with any pretense of small talk. "You are betrothed," he said, "to Thakar Ironjaw. Your father arranged it to end a blood feud." She went very still, and for a moment the wind off the fjord was the only sound between them. "Who told you? Does it matter? Is it true?" "It is true," she said, and her voice had none of its usual fire in it, only a flatness that frightened him more than anger would have. "It has been true since before the storm that near drowned you, Abel Cooper, since before I ever pulled you from the water." "Then why," he said, and his voice cracked on it and he did not care, "why in the world have you been circling back to me all this time? Why save me from that storm? Why save me from those robbers? Why seek me out on every trade route I walk if you are promised to another man?" "Because I could not stop myself," she said, so quietly he almost lost it to the wind. And then, before he could reach for what that meant, she turned and walked away from him along the cliff path, her shoulders rigid, and he understood with a sick, sinking certainty that she was not going to explain herself now any more than she had on that storm-racked beach, and that whatever she felt, she meant to bury it beneath duty and clan and a promise made before he had ever climbed back into her life. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the loft of the trading hall's guest quarters, listening to the wind off the fjord rattle the shutters, turning the little carved wolf over and over in his rough hands, and thought about a girl who had pressed a gift into a stranger's palm and walked away without a word 7 years past, and a woman who had done nothing but the same ever since, and he understood, finally, that she had been trying to protect them both from exactly this, a wanting that could not go anywhere. Hemmed in on every side by clan and blood and duty, understanding it did not make it hurt any less. She came to him 3 nights later, when he had nearly given up hope of ever hearing another word from her, climbing the ladder to the loft without a sound, and standing in the doorway with the lamp light throwing gold across the sharp planes of her face, her leather vest damp with mist off the fjord, her dark hair escaping its braid in a way that made his throat go tight. "I should not be here," she said. "Then why are you?" "Because I am tired of being sensible," she said, and crossed the small room to him. And he stood to meet her because some part of him had been waiting for this moment since a boy of 20 had gathered scattered bone carvings out of harbor mud. And when she reached up and cupped his jaw in one broad, calloused hand, he did not pull away. "Bagrak," he said, her name rough in his mouth, "if you are promised to another man, I have no right to want this." "I know," she said, and her thumb traced the line of his cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the strength coiled beneath her skin. "I have told myself the same thing every night since the storm. It has not helped in the slightest." "Then tell me why," he said. "Tell me why you keep circling back to me, Bagrak. I have asked you a dozen times and you have given me nothing but silence. I am not asking as a man who wants an easy answer. I am asking because I think I am falling in love with you, and I would rather know why I cannot have you than spend the rest of my life wondering." Something broke open in her face at that. Some wall he had not realized was still standing until it came down, and when she spoke her voice was rougher than he had ever heard it. "Because I never stopped thinking of the boy who stood beside me in that harbor mud when every grown man in that market looked away," she said. "Because when I saw your face over the gunwale of a supply boat 2 winters gone, I could not sleep for a month for thinking of it. Because I have spent 7 years telling myself it meant nothing, and every time I have found you again it has meant everything, and I do not know how to want something this badly and still do my duty to my clan." "Then do not do your duty," he said, before he could stop himself, reckless with the fear of losing her to a wedding neither of them had chosen. "Refuse the match." "It is not so simple," she said, pulling back just far enough to look at him properly, grief plain in her green eyes. "My father swore an oath before the whole clan. Thakar Ironjaw's father died in the same raid that killed my mother, Abel. This match is meant to close 30 years of blood between our houses. If I refuse it, the feud may open again, and men will die for my refusal who have nothing to do with what I want. And if you go through with it," he said quietly, "what happens to you?" She did not answer that. She did not need to. He could see the answer in the way her hands, so sure and strong on every rope and blade he had watched her handle, trembled faintly where they rested against his chest. "Kiss me," she said instead, low and fierce, "before I lose the courage to ask for it, and then leave it be, whatever comes after." He kissed her, and it was not gentle. It was hungry and desperate and tasted of salt and fear, and 7 years of wanting neither of them had understood until now. Her hands fisting in the front of his shirt, his own tangling in her loosened hair. And for one long, breathless moment the whole weight of clan and duty and blood feud fell away, and there was only the two of them finally, after 7 years of circling. When it ended she rested her forehead against his, breathing hard, and said, "I am sorry." "Do not be sorry," he said. "Be here. Whatever happens next, do not be sorry for this." She kissed him once more, softer this time, almost desperate in its tenderness, and then she was gone down the ladder into the dark, and Abel Cooper lay awake for the rest of the night with the taste of her still on his lips and the terrible knowledge that in 3 days' time she was going to marry another man. The wedding of Bagrak Wildheart to Thakar Ironjaw was to be held on the great open terrace above the fjord, where the clan held its councils and its feasts. A broad shelf of stone terraced with timber benches, and hung with banners bearing the wolf of Clan Wildheart and the anvil of Clan Ironjaw side by side for the first time in 30 years. The whole hold had turned out for it, Wildheart kin in their finest furs. Ironjaw kin come down from their own hold farther up the fjord bearing gifts of worked iron and polished ore as bride price. Human traders from Kelda's Landing standing at a respectful distance, because trade brought them here as much as curiosity. And at the center of it all, on a raised platform draped in white fox fur, Chieftain Grandar Wildheart stood ready to bind his daughter's hand to a man she had never once looked at with anything resembling desire. Abel stood at the very edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a knot of human traders who eyed him with open suspicion for even being present at an orc wedding, and watched Bagrak walk out onto that terrace in ceremonial garb that made his chest ache. A fitted gown of soft doeskin dyed the deep green of pine shadow, banded at waist and wrist with beaten silver, her dark hair unbound and crowned with a circlet of hammered iron that marked her as a chieftain's daughter. She looked magnificent. She looked like a woman being led somewhere she did not want to go, her spine too straight, her jaw too tight, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that was not her father's face, and was certainly not Thakar Ironjaw's. Thakar himself was a broad-shouldered orc with a scarred jaw and cold, assessing eyes, standing beside the platform with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted he would get what he wanted. He looked at Bagrak the way a man looks at a prize horse, and Abel's hands curled into fists at his sides at the sight of it. The ceremony began the way such things began, Grandar Wildheart speaking of old wounds and new peace, of blood that would no longer be spilled between their clans, of the bride price already counted and accepted, iron and ore laid out on a long table beside the platform for the whole hold to witness, an old custom that looked, to Abel's eyes, uncomfortably like the bidding at a livestock auction. Thakar's kin called out the value of each gift as it was presented: worked blades, smelted ore, a chest of southern coin, and with each tally the crowd murmured its approval, and with each tally Bagrak's face grew a shade paler and a shade more distant, until Abel thought he might be sick from simply watching her disappear behind that mask of resigned duty. Grandar lifted a ceremonial blade meant to cut a binding cord across the joined hands of bride and groom, the final and irreversible seal of the match, and Abel Cooper's heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought the whole terrace must hear it. He had promised himself, walking up here, that he would not do this. He had told himself 100 times over the last 3 sleepless nights that he had no right, no standing, no claim on a chieftain's daughter, that interfering in clan business as a human traitor could get him killed on the spot and could very well reopen the very feud this wedding was meant to close. He had told himself all of that, and none of it mattered at all when he watched Grandar raise that blade toward his daughter's hand. "Stop," Abel said. It did not come out as loud as he meant it to. The wind off the fjord nearly ate the word whole. But the humans near him went rigid with shock, and a few heads at the edge of the orc crowd turned, and Abel Cooper, terrified down to his bones and unable to stop himself all the same, pushed through the crowd and said it again louder, his voice cracking across the terrace like a dropped plate. "Stop! Do not cut that cord." The whole gathering turned as one, a wall of orc faces swinging toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage, and Thakar Ironjaw's cold eyes fixed on him with something between contempt and disbelief. "Who is this human?" Thakar said, "and why does he dare interrupt a Wildheart wedding?" "My name is Abel Cooper," he said, and his voice shook, but he did not stop, because stopping now meant losing her forever, and he had already lost too much to storms and silence to lose this too. "I am a salt trader who walks these passes, and I am asking you, Chieftain Grandar, before your whole hold, not to cut that cord, because your daughter does not want this marriage, and I do not believe you truly want to force it on her." A furious murmur rolled through the crowd. Somewhere behind him, a human trader hissed at him to shut his mouth before he got them all killed. Thakar's hand went to the hilt of his sword, and 2 of his kinsmen stepped forward with expressions that promised violence, and Bagrak, who had stood frozen and pale through her own binding ceremony, suddenly came alive, stepping between Abel and Thakar's kin with her whole body, one hand raised flat and hard. "No one touches him," she said, and her voice rang out over the terrace with an authority that silenced even her father. "No one." "Bagrak," Grandar said, low and warning. "This is not the time." "It is exactly the time, father," she said, turning to face him with her chin high and her eyes bright with something fierce and unafraid. "This human has pulled the truth out into the open where I did not have the courage to say it myself. I do not want this marriage. I have never wanted it. I have done my duty to this clan my whole life, and I would go on doing it, and I would have gone through with this cord and this cut and this binding, and I would have hated every day of the rest of my life for it, if he had not stood here and made me admit it in front of everyone. You would shame your clan, Thakar said, his voice a low growl, for a human traitor. I would shame nothing, Bagrak shot back. I would simply, for once, choose for myself. The terrace had gone utterly silent save for the wind and the distant crash of the fjord against the cliffs below. Abel could feel every eye on him, could feel the weight of 100 years of war and prejudice pressing down on this one impossible moment, and he stepped forward anyway, until he stood beside Bagrak in front of the whole assembled clan. I know I have no right to speak in your councils, he said, addressing Grandar directly now, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. I know what I am asking looks like madness. I am a human trader with no wealth to offer and no clan standing behind me. But I have watched your daughter pull me from a storm that should have drowned me, cut me free from robbers on the mountain road, and circle back into my life again and again when she owed me nothing at all. And I did not understand why until she told me herself 3 nights past. She has loved something in me since we were both children in a harbor market, Chieftain Grandar, the same way I did not understand until recently that I have loved something in her for just as long. I am not asking you to break your alliance with Clan Ironjaw. I am asking you not to force your daughter into a marriage that will make her miserable for the rest of her days, when there might be another way to keep your peace. There is no other way, Thakar snapped. The bride price is already accepted. The blood between our houses is already 30 years spilled. This marriage ends it. There is old law, Bagrak said, and there was something in her voice now that made the elder kin in the crowd shift and murmur among themselves. That says a Wildheart woman may claim right of challenge before the binding cord is cut, if she names a man who has bled defending her and stakes her own blood upon his claim. I know this law, father. I have known it since I was old enough to understand what a betrothal meant. I never thought I would have cause to use it. Grandar's face was a study in conflict, old grief and old pride warring with something that might have been buried deep, a father's love for a daughter he had bound to duty against her heart. That law has not been invoked in 3 generations, he said slowly. It has not been struck down either, Bagrak said. Has it, father? The old chieftain was silent for a long moment, looking between his daughter's fierce, unyielding face and the human traitor standing beside her with his fists clenched and his jaw set ready, plainly, to stand there and take whatever came next rather than step back. He has bled for you, Grandar asked finally. He stood in front of a chain meant for my throat on the mountain road not 2 months past, Bagrak said, and I dragged him from a drowning sea before that, and both times he thanked me instead of cursing his misfortune. I have watched 100 warriors fight for less reason than this man has given me to love him. Thakar's face had gone dark with fury. This is insult, he said. You would set aside a match sealed with iron and blood for a human who has never lifted a blade in his life. He has lifted his voice in front of an entire hold, Bagrak said, turning on him with a fire that made even the scarred warrior take half a step back, when doing so could have gotten him killed. That is its own kind of courage, Thakar Ironjaw, and I have seen precious little of any kind from you beyond a willingness to count iron on a bargaining table. The crowd erupted into overlapping arguments, Wildheart kin and Ironjaw kin shouting over one another, and for a moment Abel thought the whole terrace might dissolve into open violence. 30 years of buried blood feud cracking open again right in front of him because of words he had spoken. Then Grandar Wildheart raised the ceremonial blade over his head and brought the flat of it down against the platform railing with a crack like a thunderclap, and the crowd fell silent out of old habit and older respect. Old law stands, he said, his voice heavy but final. If Bagrak claims right of challenge and stakes her blood on this man's, then challenge she may claim. Thakar Ironjaw, you may answer that challenge with steel if you wish it, or you may withdraw your claim with your honor intact. for a bride taken by force of law rather than by wanting is no bride at all. And I will not have it said that House Wildheart forced misery on its own blood to buy a peace that could be bought another way. Every eye turned to Thakar Iron Joe, whose jaw worked with fury and wounded pride, his hand still resting on the hilt of his sword, and Abel felt Bagrak's hand find his in the crush of the moment, gripping hard enough to bruise, and he gripped back just as hard, because whatever happened next, he was not letting go of her. "I will not fight a woman's chosen mate over a bride who does not want me," Thakar said at last, the words dragged out of him like teeth, though there was something almost like relief buried beneath the anger. "I have iron enough and honor enough not to need this. Keep your peace, Grandar Wildheart, in whatever shape your daughter chooses to leave it. The bride price will stand as a gift between our houses, not a purchase, and the feud ends here regardless." A ragged cheer went up from somewhere in the crowd, though whether from relief at avoided bloodshed or simple astonishment at what had just occurred, Abel could not have said. Grandar Wildheart set down the ceremonial blade and looked at his daughter for a long moment, and then at Abel Cooper standing beside her with his heart still hammering fit to burst from his chest. "You have chosen a strange mate, daughter," the old chieftain said, though there was something almost gentle beneath the gruffness now. "I have chosen the mate I want, father," Bagrak said, "which is more than I believed I would ever be permitted to say." "Then say it properly," Grandar said, "before this whole hold, so there is no confusion left for anyone to argue over later." Bagrak turned to Abel, and in front of the entire assembled clan, in front of humans and orcs both who had spent generations distrusting one another across old battle lines, she took his face in both her broad, calloused hands and said, clear enough for every soul on that terrace to hear, "Abel Cooper, I claim you as my chosen mate, before my father and my clan and whatever gods watch over fools and traitors alike. I have circled back to you 100 times because some part of me knew, long before I let myself admit it, that I would keep coming back to you for the rest of my life whether I willed it or not. I am done pretending otherwise." "I claim you too, Bagrak Wildheart," Abel said, his voice thick, "though I do not know what a human's claiming is worth to your people." "It is worth exactly as much as you make it," she said, and kissed him then, right there on the terrace above the fjord, in front of her father and her clan and the ruins of a wedding that had, moments before, seemed set in stone, and the crowd's murmur shifted slowly into something that was not quite cheering but was not condemnation either. The low, startled sound of a people watching an old wound close in a way none of them had expected. The days that followed were not simple, because nothing worth having ever seemed to be simple in Abel Cooper's experience, but they were, in their own strange way, easier than he had feared. There were elders who grumbled about a human standing where a proper mate should stand, and there were human traders down at Kelda's Landing who muttered that Abel Cooper had lost his mind entirely, taking up with an orc chieftain's daughter. But there were also, slowly, quietly, small kindnesses that told him the old prejudices were not as unmovable as he had once believed. An elder woman of Clan Wildheart pressed a warm cloak into his hands the first cold night he spent in the longhouse, muttering something about not wanting Bagrak's mate to catch his death and embarrass the whole clan. A young orc boy who had once thrown stones at human trade wagons out of habit more than malice began, hesitantly, to ask Abel about the southern spice roads, wide-eyed at tales of deserts and distant harbors. Grandar Wildheart, for his part, remained gruff and watchful, testing Abel in a dozen small ways over the following weeks, asking him to haul nets alongside the fishing crews, to sit through long council sessions, where the trade tongue gave way entirely to rapid Orcish he could barely follow, to prove, again and again, that he had not simply won his daughter's hand through a moment of terrace drama, but meant to earn his place beside her every single day. Abel did not complain. He had spent his whole life being overlooked, an ordinary trader walking ordinary roads, and here, finally, was a family, however fierce, however strange to him, that demanded he prove himself worthy of being seen, and he found to his own quiet astonishment that he wanted nothing more than to meet that demand. Bagrak, for her part, seemed lighter than he had ever known her, the guarded watchfulness that had haunted her through their earlier meetings replaced by something warm and open, and when they were alone, hungrily affectionate in a way that still made his breath catch. She kept her deckhand's leathers even now that she was openly courting a mate rather than serving on her father's ships, though she traded the salt-stained vest for a newer one, still snug against her powerful frame, still practical, still entirely her, because Bagrak Wildheart had never in her life been the sort of woman who dressed for anyone's approval but her own. One evening, perhaps a month after the wedding that never was, she found him on the cliff path above the boat sheds where they had first spoken honestly of their fear, and she did not say anything at all, only took his hand and led him down toward the quiet cove where the Sea Wolf's replacement Nar rocked gently at anchor, empty of crew, lantern light spilling warm across the deck from a single lamp she had hung there earlier without his noticing. "What is this?" he asked, though something in his chest already knew, already ached with wanting to know. "This is me, finally doing what I have wanted to do since a storm put you in my arms," she said, and pulled him aboard. And there, beneath the lantern light with the fjord dark and calm around them, 7 years of circling finally, fully, closed the distance between them. She was as fierce in her tenderness as she was in everything else, careful with him in a way that made his heart ache, and when she whispered his name against his skin it sounded like something sacred, something she had been saving a long time to say properly, and he answered her the same way, with his whole heart laid bare at last, no more silence left between them, no more explanations refused. Afterward, wrapped in a shared blanket against the cold, her head resting on his chest and his fingers tracing slow patterns over the strong line of her shoulder, he asked her the question that had haunted him since that first storm-racked night. "Why did you never just tell me, Bagrak? All those months of circling back and saying nothing. Why keep it a secret?" She was quiet for a while, listening to the water lap against the hull. "Because I did not believe I was allowed to want you," she said finally. "I was promised to Thakar before I ever pulled you from that storm. Every time I found you again, every time some excuse brought me back into your path, I told myself it meant nothing, because it could mean nothing, because I had already given my word to a match I never chose. It was easier to save your life and say nothing than to tell you I loved you and then have to watch you walk away, knowing I could never follow. You could have told me to stay away," he said softly. "You could have refused to see me at all." "I tried," she admitted, tilting her head up to look at him, her green eyes soft in the lantern light. "I told myself 100 times that the next time I saw you would be the last, that I would simply do my duty and let you go on with your salt and your mountain roads and forget me. And then I would hear you were on the coast road, or see your name on a trade manifest at the docks, and I would find some reason, any reason, to be wherever you were. I could not stop myself, Abel. I circled back to you because some part of me already knew you were mine, long before I had any right to say so." "You have the right now," he said, and kissed her temple and felt her smile against his chest. "I do," she agreed, "and I intend to use it for the rest of my life." They stayed 2 more months at the clan hold above the fjord, long enough for the last of the grumbling elders to grow accustomed to the sight of a human trader walking the longhouse halls with a chieftain's daughter on his arm, long enough for Grandar Wildheart to grudgingly, and then not so grudgingly, admit that his daughter had chosen a mate with more spine than half the warriors who had once vied for her hand. Abel rebuilt what remained of his trade business with help. He had never expected Bagrak's knowledge of the fjord's moods, and the mountain road's dangers saved him more than one disaster that autumn. And her father's quiet word to the other clan traders opened doors that had stayed shut to human merchants for a generation. But it was Bagrak in the end who could not stay content within the boundaries of a single hold, whose restless heart had always belonged as much to open water and open road as to any longhouse hearth, and it was Bagrak who came to him one crisp morning with her travel leathers freshly oiled, and her old deckhand's pack slung over one shoulder, her eyes bright with a plan she had clearly been turning over for some time. "Come with me," she said. "Not up the mountain road this time. Not back to Kelda's landing either. I want to show you the length of this coast, every harbor and hold my ships have ever touched, and I want to do it as your mate, not as a deckhand hiding what she felt for a passenger she pulled from the sea." "You are asking me to give up my trade route," Abel said, though he was already smiling, already halfway to yes before she had finished asking. "I am asking you to build a new one," she corrected, "with me beside you instead of circling behind you at a careful distance, pretending I did not care whether you lived or died. I am done circling, Abel Cooper. I want to walk beside you plainly where the whole world can see it." "Then I am yours," he said, "wherever that road leads." She laughed, low and warm, the sound of it rolling out over the fjord like something uncaged. And then, before he had any warning at all, she swept him clean off his feet with the same easy strength that had once hauled him from a drowning sea, cradling him against her chest while he yelped in startled protest, and half the boat's shed crew looked on in open, delighted amusement. "Bagrak, put me down, people are staring." "Let them stare," she said, striding down toward the docks where a trade nar waited, its sail already catching the morning wind, her chin high and her eyes bright with a joy that made him forget entirely to be embarrassed. "I have spent long enough pretending I did not want what I wanted, Abel Cooper. Today the whole hold may watch me carry my chosen mate down to my ship, and they may say whatever they like about it, because I do not care what any of them think anymore. I only care what you think." "I think," he said, laughing despite himself, one arm looping around her neck as she carried him easily down the last stretch of the dock, "that I have never in my life felt as wanted as I do right now, in the arms of a woman who could have chosen anyone." "I did choose anyone," Bagrak said, setting him down at last on the deck of the ship that would carry them both toward whatever came next, keeping one strong hand curled around his own as the crew cast off the lines behind them. "I looked at every warrior and every chieftain's son my father ever paraded in front of me, and I chose a salt trader with an honest heart and no fear of standing his ground, because he was the only one who ever made me feel like more than a prize to be won. I chose you, Abel. I will keep choosing you every day for as long as you will have me." "That will be a very long time," he said, pulling her down for a kiss as the ship swung out into the fjord's cold, bright morning, the longhouses of Clan Wildheart shrinking behind them and the whole wide, wild coast opening up ahead, "because I do not intend to ever let you go." She smiled against his mouth, fierce and soft all at once, and the wind filled the sail, and the storm that had first thrown them together was nothing now but a memory, a beginning, the first thread in a life neither of them meant to spend circling anymore, only moving forward together, toward whatever the wide world had left to show them.